The La Crosse Public Library Archives presents Dark La Crosse Stories, a series in collaboration with the La Crosse Tribune, featuring the seedier side of La Crosse, Wisconsin's history. These true stories are reflections of their time and place in history. The intent is not to diminish the human suffering that may have resulted from these events, but to bring light to ways in which people in the past experienced life. The city of La Crosse and the locations where these stories took place occupy part of a vast network of the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk, and we thank our Ho-Chunk community members and their ancestors for their stewardship of this area's land and history.
In October 1927, the Crosse County Coroner Raymond Dwyer was driving to Madison with a macabre cargo, a human stomach, destined for the state toxicologist's office, exhumed from Oak Grove Cemetery just days after its burial. The city of La Crosse had been abuzz with rumors that the spouse of the former owner of this stomach, motivated by greed, had used poison to gain control of a sizable estate. The story of the stomach began decades earlier with a woman named Nona Hubble.
My Aunt Nona once said to me, "I have had an interesting life." She was born on a farm in Pennsylvania. In the early 1880s, she married George Hollenbeck, and in May of 1885, they homesteaded on 160 acres in Morrison County, smack dab in the middle of Minnesota. 3 years later, they lost the farm to mortgage foreclosure. They lived in several other places in the county while Uncle George worked at various jobs, including selling patent medicines. In early 1911, Uncle George acquired a homestead in Alberta, Canada. Aunt Nona was to join him there in the fall.
We do not know if Nona ever moved to Canada to be with her husband, though later records indicate probably not. George Hollenbeck was granted another homestead in Saskatchewan, Canada in 1914. Meanwhile, Nona Hollenbeck must have divorced George and moved to La Crosse because 2 years later, in October of 1916, she married Fred Whiteman, a La Crosse business owner.
Fred and his first wife had lived in the same county in Minnesota the same time as Aunt Nona and Uncle George. Fred had been a salesman for Booth's Medicines, just like Uncle George. Who knows when Aunt Nona's relationship with Fred started?
Fred Whiteman had been the secretary for Booth Manufacturing Company in La Crosse, producer of livestock feed and veterinary medicines, since its incorporation in 1904. He had separated from his first wife shortly after that. In 1910, Fred bought the Oriental Rug Company from Enoch Johnson, who had started the business on the north side of La Crosse in 1894. The company cleaned carpets and made rugs out of old carpets.
Poor Aunt Nona. Her second husband, Fred Whiteman, died less than a year after they got married and left her to run the business in La Crosse. Her son, my cousin Gilbert, planned to sell his farm and pool hall in Saskatchewan and move to La Crosse to take over the Oriental Rug Company. But in July of 1923, Gilbert was murdered and robbed in his pool hall. Aunt Nona sold Oriental Rug in 1924. 2 years later, she met Arthur Domstrich.
Arthur Domstrich's family had been in La Crosse since at least 1890, and his father worked for the railroad for many years. Arthur was born in 1898, and his family lived on La Crosse's north side. Arthur attended La Crosse schools, and he started playing the piano when he was in grade school.
Aunt Nona met Arthur in 1926 when he was about 30 years old. Although he was a veteran of the war, she said Arthur was a gentleman who played the piano. We wondered why he wasn't already married.
After getting out of school, Domstrich worked as a clerk. He enlisted in the Army in October of 1918, less than a month before World War I ended. Domstrich was part of a medical detachment at the base hospital at Camp Shelby in Mississippi until he was discharged in January 1919 after just 3 months of military service. After his discharge, Arthur Domstrich returned to his parents' home on St. James Street in La Crosse. He earned money as a self-employed musician.
Over the winter of 1926 to 1927, Aunt Nona and Arthur took a trip to Florida together. When they came back to La Crosse, Arthur went back to live with his parents, and she returned to her home. They continued to see each other during the summer and fall, and it was that fall of 1927 when Aunt Nona's health seemed to fail.
Nona was in perfect health when we applied for a marriage license on October 1st, 1927. There was a 5-day waiting period before we would get married, but Nona and I decided we did not want to wait. We went to the courthouse in Winona, where Judge Luby married us on October 4th. We were at a Winona hotel when Nona became ill. Later that night, she felt well enough for us to travel back to La Crosse. Just a few days after returning to La Crosse, a reporter showed up at our door.
Because of their age difference, there was curiosity about this unusual marriage. Arthur Domstrich was a 30-year-old musician, and Nona Whiteman was described as a well-to-do widow, and according to the marriage license application, was 59 years old. On Friday, October 7, just days after their wedding, Domstrich said that his wife was unable to answer questions because she was ill. Domstrich refused to reveal how long they had known each other. He would only confirm that they had been married in Winona on Tuesday and referred all other questions to his attorney, Fred Hartwell. Hartwell commented that Domstrich and Nona had been friends for years, and Domstrich had been handling Nona's business affairs. The case of the curious marriage took a tragic turn when Nona lapsed into semi-consciousness for several days. Nona died on October 15th in Lutheran Hospital, 11 days after her marriage to Domstrich. On Nona's death certificate, her age was recorded as 73 years, 9 months, and 20 days. Domstrich had provided this information. Just 2 weeks earlier, their marriage certificate stated that she was about 15 years younger.
The rumors started almost before my wife was covered with the earth at Oak Grove Cemetery. Dr. Luke's autopsy showed Nona died of an intestinal obstruction caused by a hernia in the small intestine, but there were terrible stories going around town that I had poisoned Nona just to get her money. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I asked the coroner to exhume her body and test for poison because I had to stop those awful rumors.
Nona was buried on Tuesday, October 18th and exhumed on Thursday, October 20th, so the state toxicologist could examine her stomach contents. Domstrich told a reporter the next day he was confident that it would clear him of any suspicion.
In the middle of November, the state toxicologist in Madison finally told us he did not discover any poison in Nona. My attorney and I asked the county court to appoint me as administrator of Nona's estate. Some of Nona's relatives objected, so we had to agree on the LaCrosse Trust Company to act as administrator.
When we heard about our aunt's marriage in Wisconsin to a much younger man and her untimely death just days later, we all thought something was fishy. We filed a lawsuit claiming their marriage was void because Aunt Nona was ill and insane at the time. This man Domstrich manipulated her into the marriage just to get his hands on her money.
At stake was an estate of $18,000, almost $320,000 in today's money. Domstrich, as the surviving spouse, said it should all go to him. 2 nephews and a niece in Seattle wanted the estate to go to them instead. This was the first time such a case had been heard in the Crosse County Court.
Domstrich must have recognized that we had a strong case because our attorneys settled out of court just before our trial date. Domstrich got $1,000 in cash and a piece of property in Florida worth about $900. My 2 brothers and I inherited the rest of Aunt Nona's estate.
After the settlement, Domstrich made his living playing piano at the White Front nightclub at 200 Pearl Street. He resided with his elderly mother at 307 Pearl Street. It appears they both moved to Milwaukee in the mid-1940s where Domstrich worked in an automotive factory. He died in 1955 at the age of 57. His body was cremated and the remains are buried in Oak Grove Cemetery near his parents. His grave is marked by a modest, flat Veterans Administration gravestone that memorializes his service in World War I. In death, he rejoined his bride of 11 days, who is in a separate gravesite nearby. In his almost 3 decades of life after Nona's death, Domstrich never bothered or could not afford to buy a gravestone for Nona. Nona's niece Lulu and her 2 brothers, who had inherited thousands of dollars from Nona, never thought or cared enough to buy a gravestone for her either. Nona Hubble Hollenbeck Whiteman Domstrich, whose disembodied stomach created a sensation for a short time in lacrosse history, lies in an unmarked grave in Oak Grove Cemetery. And now I'd like to welcome in Jeff Rand, retired La Crosse Public Library Adult Services librarian who did some of the initial research for this story.
This story highlights aspects of human nature that are almost as old as humankind itself. The gaps and contradictions in the historical records also leaves us with many tantalizing questions. Why and when did Nona Hubble's marriage to her first husband, George Hollenbeck, end? Her second husband, Fred Whiteman, died within a year of marrying Nona. We only know that he died because of a probate announcement in the August 21st, 1917 legal notices of the La Crosse Tribune. Nothing else about his death appears in any newspaper we can access, and there is no death certificate for him in La Crosse County. Why was there no mention of a city business owner's death in the local newspaper? Were Nona Whiteman and Arthur Domstrich really in love? Or was this a case of a young con man motivated by greed who manipulated a much older woman? Even though he did not kill his wife, Arthur had to know he was a good bet to outlive Nona by many years. Arthur was young enough to be Nona's son. Did she see Arthur as a replacement for her own murdered son? When we see contemporary marriages with large age gaps, the so-called May-December romance, it is usually the man who was older. Does it even raise eyebrows anymore when a senior citizen actor or musician marries a 20-something woman? Even if this does not, we cannot help but think about the motives of both parties. How old was Nona when she married Arthur? Depending on the source, she was either 58, 59, 66, or 73 years old. Why was her age different on their marriage application and her death certificate when those documents were filled out less than 2 weeks apart? Was this an honest mistake, or was somebody trying to hide something? The people who could shed light on these mysteries are long gone. As historians, we must rely on what we find in historical records. To do anything else is just speculation. Thanks for listening.